This is The World This Weekend. Good evening, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Tonight, hundreds are dead after a horrific train crash in India.
I was just walking, and there were just lines of coaches lying on either side, and the scene was getting even more and more disastrous.
Also tonight, cautious optimism in Nova Scotia.
If you step outside, you will see something beautiful. Rain. And hopefully lots of it.
Rain brings some relief in the battle against the province's largest ever wildfire. And a southern Ontario city roots for a hometown hero in the NBA Finals.
I saw his interview where he was talking a lot about Kitchener, and it was awesome. But I love that he's kept it real and being like, no, I'm from Kitchener.
That's later, but first. We begin tonight with the devastating train crash in India, the worst in decades. Officials say close to 300 people have been killed and more than 1,000 injured. 3 trains collided Friday night in a rural area in the east of the country. The Prime Minister is promising a full investigation and punishment for those responsible. But India's busy railway has a long history of accidents. The CBC's South Asia correspondent Salima Shivji has more.
A frenzied search operation in India's eastern state of Orissa. Rescue workers rushed to the scene of the train crash, making their way around the mangled metal, climbing over toppled and broken passenger carriages to pull out survivors.
All around bloodied face, arms, severed arms. They were shouting for help, cries of help, wailings.
Anubhav Das was in one of the last coaches, one that stayed upright. He survived without any injuries and tried to help the other passengers. But the horror of the crash haunts him.
Headless bodies without limbs, cries of help all around. Extreme disaster. In such a situation where there is bodies all around, it is almost like a war-like situation.
The search teams flown into Orissa's Balasore district treated it as if on a war footing, using metal cutters to extract victims from the twisted wreck and rescue dogs to sniff out any signs of life. Hundreds of injured filled local hospitals, which had to call in medical personnel from neighboring areas as reinforcements. But as the hours passed, the rescue turned to a recovery. Almost everyone who is still alive has been rescued. We're taking out the dead bodies now, says Jacob Kispada, senior commander of India's National Disaster Response Force. The aftermath of one of India's deadliest train accidents ever. Officials believe an express passenger train going 130 kilometers an hour left its designated track and hit a stationary freight train. Several carriages spilled onto the opposite track when another high-speed train heading in the other direction crashed into them. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited the accident site in the afternoon and spoke with some of the injured. I'm deeply pained, he says. The government is with the victims' families in their hour of grief. He also promised a full investigation. Whomever is found guilty, Modi says, will get the strictest punishment. As workers towed some of the crushed train cars away from the tracks, a preliminary report appeared to blame a possible signal failure for the crash. Still, the deadly accident has already renewed long-standing questions about safety on India's railways. Several hundred accidents take place every year on the vast network carrying 13 million passengers, even as the Modi government has spent billions on upgrading the railway's aging tracks. As prayers rang out in different parts of India and in Orissa state on a day of mourning for the victims, the question now for the survivors is how this could have happened and why. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Mumbai.
Nova Scotia is feeling the relief from much-needed rainfall. The weather has helped to cut the number of wildfires in the province in half, from 10 to 5, and only one is still burning out of control. But while there is a sense of optimism today, officials are reminding Nova Scotians that the fight is far from over. Sam Sampson reports.
A red and white tent is going up in a baseball diamond in Shelburne in southern Nova Scotia. In the pouring rain, volunteers and a few Halifax firefighters are putting up 6 of these, all to house firefighters coming in to help battle the biggest wildfire ever recorded in this province.
We will get 300 all in this ball field.
Dennis Pitts is with Halifax Fire. He and a skeleton crew came down to help set these up. More tents are coming from Toronto tomorrow, because even with relentless rain, that fire still needs people to put it out.
Definitely this weather that we're having is slowing it down. We'll get the fire out in the trees, but it's a fire that's on the ground and underground is where the real heavy work is going to take place, and that's where the labor really requires a lot of people.
The fire threatening this county and others is near Barrington Lake. It's more than 23,000 hectares in size. About 6,700 people are displaced, half of Shelburne County's entire population. To help, more crews are on the way, more maritime firefighters, Americans, Costa Ricans, and eventually the Canadian Armed Forces. They're getting trained in New Brunswick today. Many of the new resources in Nova Scotia are heading here since the situation near Halifax has turned for the better. The rain in Halifax has been an immense help. With the added moisture, firefighters have switched to the status of the blaze threatening the Halifax area. It was out of control, now it's held.
When we get a little bit of rain, sometimes that lulls us into a bit of a false sense of security.
But still, David Steeves with the Department of Natural Resources and Recyclables warns this isn't over yet.
Given the terrain and the fuels that we are dealing with in this particular area, there could be ambers hiding in places that maybe this rodder's not going to get to. So that's why it takes such an extensive amount of time for us to declare a fire out.
Some evacuees in the Halifax area were allowed to return home, but many are still forced out. Premier Tim Houston says it may not totally be safe.
Stay out of those areas. We understand the urgency. Once it's deemed safe from a fire perspective, and the recommendation is made to the municipality, there's also other steps to take to make sure it's just safe from other dangers after, so just be patient.
Here in Shelburne and much of southern Nova Scotia, the fight is expected to last much longer. These tents are expected to fill up with the resources to eventually get people home. Sam Sampson, CBC News, Shelburne, Nova Scotia.
To learn more about what's causing the fires in Nova Scotia, we reached Dr. Piyush Jain. He's a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. He spoke to us a little earlier from Edmonton. Dr. Jain, what do we know about what's behind the wildfires we're seeing in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, well, there's been an exceptional year in that there was well below normal levels of rainfall in April and May, which led to these mild to moderate drought conditions. So that prolonged period of no rain really set up those fuels, the trees down there to burn. And that combined with some extreme fire weather conditions, meaning hot, dry and windy, really led to these fires occurring.
I mean, you mentioned it was a bit exceptional. We don't normally think of Nova Scotia as particularly prone to wildfires, but how unique are the conditions we've seen this year?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Nova Scotia historically has not had a very active fire season, but this year has been different. So they've already, as of Friday, there were 207 fires recorded in Nova Scotia. The most comparable year was 2017, where there were over 100. And the next largest year in terms of area burned was 1976. This year, we've already had 3.1 million hectares burned in Canada, which when you look at the last 20 years is well above average for this time of year. I think we're beginning to learn a large part of this spring fire activity can be when you have these very dry fuels before things start to get green. The fuels are much drier. And then you combine that with some extreme fire weather conditions, some days above plus 30, very low relative humidity, high winds, and the conditions are just right for fires to occur. And that's what happened this year, not only in the west, but also we're finding now in the east and in the maritime provinces.
And then do you think this is just a one-off sort of situation, or could we see more of this kind of fire activity in the future?
Oh, we could certainly see more in the future. I mean, there is, as the climate warms, we're getting warmer and drier atmospheric conditions, which can dry out the fuels and the forests and lead to more activity. We expect it to get warmer and a little bit wetter in Nova Scotia going into the future, but that extra rainfall will probably not be enough to compensate for the increase in temperature.
Well, looking a bit more generally, I understand you've studied extreme wildfire events. What did your research find about their frequency?
Well, every year there is extreme wildfire events. It's just the question is where those are going to occur. I mean, we do have the occasional very quiet year in Canada. 2020 was a relatively quiet year compared with the other years, either side of that. extreme fire weather conditions have already been shown to have increased over the last 40 years. So that's that hot, dry, windy weather I was talking about. Mm-hmm. And we expect that to continue to change under climate change. So when those conditions are present, we expect these extreme fire episodes to occur. And there's no reason to expect, apart from the fact that ignitions and human behavior sort of tie into the whole thing, there's no reason to expect why those conditions won't continue to manifest in the future and get worse.
Any recommendations, do you think, for Canada to try to fireproof, I guess, in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, fire is a natural part of the boreal forest. So the regeneration of the boreal forest requires some fire on the landscape. But what we're seeing is perhaps an excess of fire occurring. And the real problem is when this occurs where people live, of course, right? At the interface between urban areas and forested areas. So in those regions, we really need to manage the forest and the land very carefully to make sure that communities are protected. And one of the ways that can be done is by simple things like removing fuels from very close to properties. As a society, I think there's a lot of adaptation that's going to have to occur. If people continue, and people do live there, we can't ask them to leave, but we just need to be mindful of the fact that when we live in these forested areas, the chance for catastrophe is going to get higher under a warming climate.
Dr. Jain, thank you so much for this.
You're welcome.
Dr. Piyush Jain is a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. We reached him in Edmonton. Now, in Quebec, wildfires have forced about 13,000 people to leave their homes. Most of the fires in that province are near the city of Sept-Îles on the North Shore. Federal Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos says about 200 members of the Canadian Armed Forces will be deployed to the region to support firefighting efforts.
Canadian Armed Forces are or will be on the ground very soon to support transportation needs, to support evacuation needs, to secure people and goods so that firefighters and other first responders can do the work to protect the communities and the families.
Alberta has already seen its worst fire season in 40 years, but the situation is improving, and as of midnight tonight, Alberta's state of emergency will be lifted. One fire in particular is still of concern, though. It's threatening a First Nation community in northern Alberta. As Philip Lishanok tells us, First Nations are at higher risk of repeated evacuations from fires.
This is truly an international effort.
Christy Tucker from Alberta Wildfire says today 215 South African firefighters arrived, joining about 1,000 that came from the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Much needed help as almost 60 wildfires are burning, 15 of them out of control.
They'll be sent out to wildfires we continue to fight across the province.
The biggest fire continues to threaten the remote community of Fort Chipewyan in northeastern Alberta. Nearly 1,000 people have fled their homes. That's most of the town. Only a few stayed behind to fight the fires, including Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation Chief Alan Adam, who posted this message on social media.
We want you back home, and we'll bring it. Make sure you guys come home to your homes.
Tara McGee is a professor at the University of Alberta who studies First Nations wildfire evacuations. She says because they're located in remote areas of the boreal forest, Indigenous communities face a greater threat from wildfires and the stress from evacuating their homes.
People have very little time to prepare to leave in the middle of the night or very last minute notice. Once people return to the community, that's not the end of the distress that people feel.
A recent Canadian Forest Service survey found that 60% of First Nations are located in areas at high risk for wildfires. Brenna Walsh with the Ecology Action Centre says the risks will increase over the next decade.
The hotter and drier conditions that are caused by climate change can exacerbate extreme weather events like dry and drought conditions that can cause fires.
In a briefing this week, Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair said 2.7 million hectares of forest have burned across Canada.
To put that in some context, that's over 5 million football fields.
An early start to what could be Canada's most destructive wildfire season ever. Philip Lishanok, CBC News, Toronto.
The state in eastern India that experienced that deadly rail crash has also had the most devastating forest fires in that country. Inside Odisha's heavily forested mountain regions, indigenous communities are taking it upon themselves to become custodians of the land and teach one another how to prevent and diminish forest fires. Freelance reporter Murali Krishnan brings us that story.
In the village of Kudupakya, a campaign is on to educate residents on how they can help prevent forest fires. The message is spread through songs and dance. They're sung in Kui, the local dialect of the Kanda tribe. Dipin Diggle has been instrumental in spreading the word. His indigenous-led campaign has teamed up with other organizations with the support of UNICEF.
We use our traditional drums to tell the community that a forest fire has been seen. So let us go and shut down that fire. We do that exercise daily basis during these forest fire days.
Odisha state has already seen a high number of forest fires this year, many in the mountainous Kandhamal region where Kudupakya is located. And with summer approaching and temperatures on the rise, thousands of square kilometers of forest lands could be devoured this year.
In a day, we have seen fire burning 17 to 20 forests at a time. I have seen that kind of fire, which is extended from days long, like 7 days, 10 days, 15 days, until the next rain doesn't happen.
Churches also play a role. Many people in Kandhamal are Christian. Father Anil Kumar Diggle leads the local parish. He preaches a message of environmental stewardship.
In my preaching, I advise them and I instruct them that whenever you are inside jungle, you try to save the jungle. Jungle itself gives us real life in our life so that our future generation will have good benefit about it.
Many of the fires are started by people. Some are lit by poachers who use the flames to flush out animals. Others by villagers who burn dry leaves in order to pluck the maua flowers underneath. The flowers are used to make a local brew. Fire prevention goes beyond just public education. Local volunteers are also focused on community-level solutions, creating a fire line by scouring the forest and removing dried leaves, which help the flame spread. Arup Pradhan is one such volunteer.
Forests are our lifeline, and we allow these fires to rage. We will lose everything. There will be no forest produce, and our water sources will dry up. We need to act fast to stop fires.
The indigenous tribes have lived in this region for centuries, and many are reliant on the forest for their livelihoods. Dip and Diggle again.
Starting from the toothbrush to all the edibles, we collect honey, we collect essentials, we collect leaves, we collect our logs, we build our house, everything we get it from forest. Even the medicines also we get it from forest only.
Becoming custodians of the forest before their traditional way of life goes up in smoke. Murali Krishnan for CBC News, Odisha, India.
Quebec's provincial police force has confirmed the deaths of 4 children after they were found unresponsive early this morning. First responders were called to a site on the St. Lawrence River in the town of Portneuf-sur-Mer, northeast of Quebec City. The children, all above age 10, were part of a larger group of 11 people. They were fishing in the river on foot when a tide swept them away. 6 people were rescued. A police search is underway for one adult man who is still missing.
Türkiye'nin her bir vatandaşının enerjisini.
Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan calls on the country's citizens to put aside their differences and focus on the future. He made the speech to Parliament in Ankara just after being sworn in for another 5-year term. Erdogan was re-elected last weekend, extending his presidency into a 3rd decade. The ceremony was attended by several high-level officials and leaders, including NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. U.S. President Joe Biden has finally signed legislation suspending the country's debt limit. With a deadline just 48 hours away, once again, the world's largest economy came close to a potential default. The CBC's Chris Reyes has the story.
That thump, the sound of President Joe Biden closing the book on a bill he just signed, marking a ceremonial close to another dramatic chapter in U.S. politics. In a tweet this afternoon, Biden defended what he called a bipartisan budget agreement that reduced the deficit while safeguarding Social Security, Medicare, and help to veterans. Without the deal, a default was imminent. The government would not have been able to pay its bills as of this coming Monday. Biden gave a rare Friday night address from the Oval Office.
Passing this budget agreement was critical. The stakes could not have been higher. If we had failed to reach an agreement on the budget,
the deal cuts government spending by more than $1 trillion over the next 10 years, caps spending for 2 years, and raises the debt limit to $31 trillion. That compromise, a result of weeks and months of intense wrangling between the White House and U.S. lawmakers. Scathing reaction from Democrats who voted against the bill, including Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren.
This is about paying the ransom to a bunch of hostage takers. And that is not how we should run this government.
Meanwhile, Biden praised Republican leaders, including House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, for making compromises to reach a deal.
We were straightforward with one another, completely honest with one another, respectful with one another. Both sides operated in good faith. Both sides kept their word.
The agreement suspends the debt limit until after the next presidential election, leaving the contentious issue off the table during the long, drawn-out campaigning that leads up to the big vote. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
Jamal Murray fever is blanketing the city of Kitchener, Ontario. The point guard with the Denver Nuggets is playing in the NBA Championship Series against the Miami Heat. Murray was born and raised in Kitchener and started playing basketball at a very young age at a city community center. Now the city is supporting him with watch parties during the NBA Finals. The CBC's Joe Pavia tells us how Murray's Kitchener roots shaped him and about the love he's getting in return.
And your Western Conference champion, Denver Nuggets!
A young fan at a downtown Kitchener restaurant cheers on hometown basketball hero Jamal Murray for the first of a series of watch parties organized by the city. Word of the celebrations got back to the NBA star.
It's been nice. I've had a lot of friends text me about the watch parties or them just gathering around. So the support's been crazy back home. That means a lot.
Fan Chrissy says she's pleased to hear Murray hasn't forgotten where he came from.
I saw his interview where he was going up Mount Trashmore and he was talking a lot about Kitchener and it was awesome. And it was on a mainstream thing that plays in the States, which a lot of people just associate Toronto, but I love that he's kept it real and being like, no, I'm from Kitchener.
One of the watch parties organized by the city of Kitchener will take place near the cement court where Jamal played when he was a young boy.
Grew up right down there behind Stanley Park Mall on Holborn Drive.
Yazan Hashem says he played on the same neighborhood court at the Stanley Park Community Center.
This used to be like the center where like the kids from that side would meet up, and we come from here from that side, so that was the center point, and we always hung out around here. And Jamal was one of those kids that always was shooting basketball with us. And
Jamal Murray started bouncing the basketball at the age of 3. By the time he was in his tweens, he played against high school and college players. He would eventually trade the cement court in Kitchener and take his game to the wooden hard court of the Elite Prep Basketball Academy in Orangeville, Ontario, where he was coached by Larry Blunt.
It's not as chronicle how grounded and how well of a good of a young man that he is.
Blunt says Murray's on-court play is competitive, but he hasn't forgotten his roots.
His mom, Sylvia, and his father, Roger, and his little brother, Lamar, they're really an amazing family, and they really have grounded him, and it's really neat. You know, there's a lot of people don't know, but after every game, that's the first people that he often goes up to see, even in the NBA.
Back in Kitchener,
as Jamal Murray knocks down the first shot of the game.
Fans like Joel Klassen cheer on the Jamal they knew and the Jamal now on the NBA court.
I was in a grade 8 class with Jamal, so I'm happy to see him come this far and hope he goes all the way and wins it. He's a really friendly guy, always had a smile on his face, and yeah, he's really fun to be with. He's a really good athlete, all sports, not just basketball. So
Jamal Murray turns the corner, takes advantage of the angle.
Joe Pavia, CBC News, Kitchener.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. Starting Mondays, you can download a special curated edition of the program featuring our favorite stories from the weekend. It's already June 4th in Hong Kong, and its Victoria Park will be occupied by a carnival, a celebration of the handover of Hong Kong from the UK to China in 1997. But for decades, on June 4th, thousands of people would gather in the park for a more solemn tradition, a vigil to honor the victims of the 1989 massacre in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. As Andrew Wood reports, the silencing of the annual vigil is another sign of the Chinese government's crackdown on Hong Kong's democratic freedoms.
Everybody should act in accordance with law and think of what they do so as to be ready to face the consequences.
There were no clear answers from John Lee this week. When asked, Hong Kong's chief executive would not say whether Hong Kongers could mourn the victims of the Tiananmen Square massacre privately. 34 years ago, China's government sent troops and tanks to crush a weeks-long pro-democracy demonstration in Beijing. The number of people who died is not known. Estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. Vigils to commemorate the massacre started the following year in Hong Kong and continued after the British colony was handed over to China. And then the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and authorities banned large gatherings to protect public health. Pandemic restrictions were lifted this year, but Hong Kong's draconian and opaque national security law has resulted in crackdowns on protests and put hundreds of activists in jail.
The worst is when everybody pretend to be sleeping, and that's how you can generate whole generations of forgetfulness, and that's what happened to mainland China.
Casey Wong is a Hong Kong artist and activist who moved to Taiwan for his safety. He notes that on mainland China, memories of June the 4th, 1989 have been suppressed by the government, and he worries that the same thing's happening in Hong Kong. In recent months, Hong Kong's public libraries have removed books about Tiananmen. Radio and TV documentaries have disappeared from the website of the public broadcaster RTHK, while the Catholic Church in Hong Kong no longer holds masses for Tiananmen victims.
Thank goodness that half million of Hong Kong people left, and they preserve their culture abroad. And the more they suppress, basically, the more it will spread. So I think, in that sense, I think it's still hopeful.
Wong says for Hong Kongers to keep their freedom alive, it's vital that they also preserve the memories of Tiananmen Square. Andrew Wood for CBC News, Hong Kong.
As people in Hong Kong and around the world remember the victims of Tiananmen Square, they may also be thinking of some of the songs that came to define the protest, like this one, Nothing to My Name by Chinese singer-songwriter Cui Jian. Known as the father of Chinese rock, his defining moment came during the 1989 protests when Nothing to My Name became the students' unofficial anthem. Just days before the tanks rolled in, Cui performed at Tiananmen Square wearing a red bandana tied over his eyes to support students on a hunger strike. He first performed the song in 1986, and the lyrics are open to interpretation. It seems like a love song, but has been viewed as a political metaphor, and the words resonated with the disillusioned protesters. I'll give you my dreams and give you my freedom, but you just laugh at me. I've nothing to my name. Later, communist authorities denied Cui permission for concerts, censored his lyrics, and blocked him from playing the song. Despite that, just like the memory of those who were in Tiananmen Square, it has endured. So we'll leave you with a little more of Cui Jian's Nothing to My Name. You've been listening to The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Good night.